as a whole. I like the beginning part where it says it's dust capital, and the capital is so reads it, and that's funny because I wrote that. You can lay on this.
I want an open chair.
Oh, is this chair being Thanks. That's really little chairs.
Okay, we're down here. Okay. You're on. All right, we're good.
Just sit.
You want to come Tim is already on? Oh, okay. All right, so here's what I want everyone to do, because we're gonna actually look at some figures. If you go to my Facebook page, I just made a post public on Bureau of Labor and Justice Statistics. It's from April 5th. You should be able to find it. Everybody got it?
Yeah.
Date's April. I think April 5th? Yeah, April 5th. Yeah, it's posted April 5th.
Can you reshare it?
Yeah, I can do that.
So you want me to like screenshot it and email it to you?
Can you accept my friend request too?
Somebody's a friend requested me, I accepted it.
Because me.
Who was it?
Oh no, it wasn't me.
Gia?
You're such a neutral friends.
Alright, I'll share this with you.
Can you use it to do anything?
Don't put it with J. It's Carl. No, it's Carl.
Alright, so I just shared the
Labor for
Yes. Everybody got it?
You're around. Don't get reply.
Yeah, Brianna, you can put those all of us.
Alright, quiet down. Does everybody have it? Yes, alright. It should be the first post on my page now because I just made it public.
I see.
Alright, there we go. So let's start off with Aaron Lacey's exponential discrimination. The most endangered Title VII plaintiff, exponential discrimination against black males. A few things here, right? So I'm going to give you a summary. After intersectionality was introduced in the late 1980s, early 1990s by Kimberly Crenshaw, there was an immediate response in the mid-1990s that was going under the name of post-intersectionality theory. Post-intersectionality theorists like Nancy Enright and people like Peter Kwan had raised concerns that intersectionality, which questioned a single axis identity such as race but excluded gender, as in the case of Crenshaw, really just created dual axis centers. In other words, Kwan specifically argues in his essay on co-synthesis that intersectionality under Crenshaw simply recentered the subject. So whereas race may have said it stood for black men, race and gender only stands for black women. He's like, that's not an accomplishment because the intersection still points to a very specific body. Does that make sense to everyone? So you're not getting a plurality of different ways to look at things. You're just creating you're creating an analytical or abstract reason just to talk about black women. As you could expect, people weren't very happy with Kwan's argument, but Kwan makes a few points that I think is necessary for us to consider. The first of which being, how does intersectionality work? He says that the assumption of intersectionality is if you pluralize identities, you should gain both a greater understanding of the subject and that should lead to greater freedom. So he looks at, in his article specifically, he looks at the Jeffrey Dahmer case. And Jeffrey Dahmer had an Asian, I don't want to say it was an Asian boyfriend, but he was victimizing an Asian man, sexually violating and raping him, and he ended up killing him. He says two cops see this, how do they read it intersectionally? So they read Jeffrey Dahmer as white, as male, but homosexual. So he's like, that recognition of his homosexuality in this situation should have led to a more liberatory understanding of the project. He's like, but it did not. Why? Because when you look at the Asian homosexual male who's had it, having lobotomies and his brain, traumatized, etc., and ultimately killed by Dahmer, he says the two white cops don't see that. So there's still an erasure of the Asian male's homosexuality. So there's not progressive political ends that are accomplished by recognizing multiple identities. So he says, if you recognize that it's an Asian male who's gay, but you put him alongside a white gay male who's killing him, then why do we not understand certain progressive identities or political ends with that? He says, in fact, the recognition of homosexuality and then the addition of whiteness made it worse because the white man identified with the white man and excused the homosexual act, versus if it was a woman, they would probably be more concerned about the domestic issue that they came up with, right? So he says this is the weakness of intersectionality, that it depends on very specific progressive or liberal goals to align with coalitional goals. We don't have an idea of domestic disputes between same-sex gentlemen or peoples, at least in the mid-1990s. That wasn't really much of a conversation. So there's a complete misrecognition, even though you have an intersectional lens. So he says you can't guarantee the outcome. Does that make sense? Right? The second question that Kwan raises is he suggests that we have to concern ourselves with how far intersectionality can go. So if you base intersectionality off black women's experiences or poor black women's experiences, race, class, and gender, how far can you push that? How many categories can you add? Is it useful to have one subject rather than try to look at different categories independently and how they actually have an effect on each other? Here's what I mean by that. If intersectionality centers black women, then what assumptions do you have to make about what happens to black women that pollutes the category? So if we say something like gender, does gender really help us to understand things? It's not a trick question. Do you think gender helps us understand certain circumstances? You say yes? Okay. So when we say gender, what do we mean? You said it helped you understand things, John. So what does it mean when you say gender? Short answer.
As opposed to sex is sort of the social attributes attached to being one sex or another. Right.
So that means, so notice, you said being sexist, what's attached to certain things given one gender or another.
It's as opposed to sex, which is like...
Sure, biological, right.
The social aspect.
Okay. So let's take that consideration. What do you actually learn? So if you use gender as a marker, everything you put gender to connotes sexism, right? When we analyze gender, don't we bring in the baggage of sexism and patriarchy? Yes or no? Yes, right? And this is what people like Oyewumi, who we read later, but people like Kwan are saying. It's already predetermined. So you know when you talk about a gender axis, you mean the history of patriarchy, sexism, the negative effects on women, right? Yes, really quick.
Just because patriarchy and sexism affects how we view gender, why does that mean that we're sort of like obfuscating how we actually analyze gender as opposed to sort of like...
Well, give me a separate analysis of it. What other analysis do you use gender for? Because I asked you, I was like, how do you see gender? What do we learn from gender?
It helps us analyze why certain things happen to certain people in like a gender context, right?
Yeah, but what's the gender context? Patriarchy.
Right, yeah.
Exactly.
So should we not analyze that?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you should analyze it, but you shouldn't analyze it as only one thing.
Okay.
Right? So Kwan is arguing that because these axes have one consequential determinant, right, which is the same thing that people like Sylvie Winter and Oyewumi argue, that it clouds the way we look at it, because we should be studying women. But when you study women, you get a much bigger bowl of women's experiences than just patriarchy, right? And this is the same argument that you'll see in Judith Butler when we get to the lecture on gender and hegemonic masculinity. We're going to read her introduction to gender trouble, and you'll see her making the very same kind of arguments about how certain categories are essentially tied to certain kind of histories. That being said, Kwan suggests that we need a co-synthesis theory, where you have multiple and never-ending categories of analysis. Because he says that those things will run up into each other, So they'll contradict if you're talking about masculinity or subordinate masculinity versus, the traditional understanding of gender. If you're talking about disability and migration status, etc. It's like these will problematize the kind of essential histories and subjects associated with certain categories. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay? Heinrich and Kwan pretty much wrote the first 2 articles in post-intersectionality. The articles we're reading today are much more specifically tailored to conversations between black scholars against Crenshaw and intersectionality. I'd like to start with D. Aaron Lacey's piece on Title VII. On page 555, he argues that intersectionality theory argues that race and sex discrimination claims are oftentimes limited to the experiences of the privileged members of the group. Therefore, sex discrimination claims are viewed in terms of the race-privileged women or white women, while race discrimination claims are viewed in terms of sex-privileged blacks, which are black men. Crenshaw seems to view black men as privileged because of their sex. It's very important. We're going to question that in the next session when we get to social dominance theory. He suggests how few scholars, however, have taken up this cause on behalf of black men, and those scholars who have taken up the cause have failed to supply an analytic framework for within those concepts or problems to operate within. So he argues that when we talk about discrimination in intersectionality, and remember, what are the terms that we learned last time? How many different theories of intersectionality are there? 3. What are they?
Name all 3?
Yes, all 3.
Additive, and then additive, crap, I can't remember the I one. Interactive.
Right, interactive. What's the last one? Invisibility, right? So we've read that there are 3 different aspects or analytic frameworks of intersectionality that we can find in literature. The first is additive. Race plus sex equals greater discrimination. The next one is interactive. A synergistic combination of the 2 creates a unique subject in the black woman's unique experience, etc. Those 2 theories, according to Purdy and Hughes and Ibach, have failed. Hence, intersectional invisibility is the response to social dominance theory. You have to know those 3 things, okay? Lacey is arguing that intersectionality, he is largely talking about the interactive and additive frame in this case, have failed to talk about the discrimination of black men, right? He thinks that we should talk about discrimination of black males as exponentially affecting black men and boys. How does he get to that argument? If we go to page 564. Everybody got 564? You have this reading?
The article title. In the Dropbox, it's by title, not author.
The most endangered Title VII plaintiff?
What page?
564. Section 3, the black male, the case for a special category. Lacey argues that the additive and interactive approach don't hold when you talk about black males because black maleness intensifies, or what he will come to call exponentially multiplies the perspectives or categories of threat. He says the assumption that black men are similarly situated to black women because of race and similarly situated to white men because of sex is true in certain circumstances or certain situations. However, in many important ways, the assumptions are false. So he's questioning the fact that black men are different than white men in terms of race, but similar based on sex. The convergence of race and sex in the black male creates something different from white masculinity and black femininity. So notice this is questioning the analytic of black male privilege or male privilege within the intersectional calculus. There are many classical stereotypes related to whiteness. Some adjectives include innocence, worthiness, competence, collegial, articulate, intelligent, and non-threatening. People never call me those things. At the same time, stereotypes related to blackness are athletic, incompetent, guilty, unworthy, occupational instability, primitive morality, threatening, and dangerous. Stereotypes related to males are competent, rational, assertive, aggressive, leaders, and self-reliant, while stereotypes related to females are fragile, weak, helpless, lacking in aggression, family-oriented, good, passive, submissive, expressive, virtuous, pure, and innocent. When combined, these stereotypes create something different for white men, black women, and black men. The stereotypes related to white men generally mirror the stereotypes related to men. The stereotypes related to white men are intelligent, primary breadwinners, self-reliant leaders, competitive, aggressive, and competent. Stereotypes related to black women are sexually aggressive, provocative, religious, loyal, motherly, assertive, crafty, mistrustful, strong, determined, quick-tempered, hypersexual, and attitudinal. Black women are sometimes subjected to negative racial and sexual stereotypes, while the stereotypes related to black men are unintelligent, violent, dangerous, criminal, physically imposing, aggressive, hypersexual, ignorant, unskillful, and arrogant. People call me arrogant all the time, I know that. He suggests on page 566 that black men are always subject to negative racial stereotypes. In this respect, they are like black women and unlike white men. But when it comes to gender, masculinity is sometimes attributed to black men and sometimes not. Important distinction. So post-intersectionality, specifically when it's dealt with this question of male privilege as an analytic under the gender category in intersectional thought, has claimed that masculinity is not always operative when you put together black and male. Said differently, he says that at the analytic level, what we think of blackness and what we think of maleness, when those two things are combined, put together in relation, cuts off and sometimes inverts the meaning of maleness. So whereas you have white men who are self-reliant, intelligent, etc., black men are unworthy, dangerous, primitive, untrustworthy, and lazy. So he says that this is not just the racism part. This is a synergistic combination that's specific to black males.
If you said Lacey is additive, wouldn't this imply that Lacey's interactive?
Yes, I said Lacey is responding to the interactive and additive claims of intersectionality. Yeah, his an exponential account could be seen as a kind of interactive. So he says that black men are generally deemed to not fit the definition of masculinity. So he says when you look at the subject, black men are basically, like this out of my book, not men. They don't fit within that definition. They are not viewed as breadwinners, leaders, hardworking, protective, strong, authoritative, dependable fathers, husbands, or brothers. The perceived lack of masculinity may be because of racism or racial stereotypes, or racial stereotypes may simply aggravate the problem. However, what emerges from this combination of race and gender is the figure of a pathetically weak, black never-do-well. On the other hand, there are times when masculinity is attributed to black men, and the combination of race and gender creates something else. The figure of the overly threatening, out-of-control, oversexed, super macho criminal or athlete. In both cases, black men are unlike white men because they are black and because they are either too masculine or not masculine enough. In addition, they are not like black women because failing to be masculine is not necessarily the same thing as being feminine. And that's a very important distinction, right? And when you read black male authors throughout history, be it Richard Wright, be it James Baldwin, every author gives you this concept of what we'll talk about later when we discuss the book, the man not. And here's what I mean by that. When you look ethnologically at the 19th century, you find out that the opposite of man is not woman. Because within the categories of having man and woman, you could only be white. Everyone else was savages. They were like animals, right? There were no genders. So for white people, and including white feminists, so you're going to love the stuff that I found in the archive about white people. You're going to love it. Okay? When we read that, what you see is that white women said that the opposite of white man were savage men. So men nots, which actually works pretty well analytically, A not A, right? The opposite of man is not man, right? Woman is a component of man. At least historically, that's how it developed, right? So that's where white feminists got it wrong. I gave them a compliment, so I have to take it back. Right? No, but that's where white feminists got it wrong in their analytic disposition, right? How does this affect the way that you debate and understand these arguments? Well, many of the arguments that we talk about under the intersectional calculus presupposes a kind of stability around the gender category. And here's what I mean by that. You have man-woman. Intersectionality says these two things are coded as white. So an intersectional analysis on the woman's side of this leads to black women, Chicanas, Latinas, indigenous, well, all these different histories, disability, etc. But there is no pluralization on the man category. Because the male category works as, well, white man, black man is lesser white man, Latino man is lesser black man, right? It marks how the lesser power of the male category. So the reason I said, how do we think about the gender category, is if you think of gender as being patriarchal or male dominance, then race doesn't change what that is, it just lessens the power. So white men exercise the most power of patriarchy, black men don't have the ability to do so, they still want to do so according to intersectionality theorists, but they can't, so they're just lesser patriarchs. And it goes through that kind of delineation. Whereas when we're talking about the woman category, we have a whole new world open to us, right? Because gender on the woman's side, white women are oppressed by white men and capitalism and all these other things. Black women are oppressed by sexism and racism and capitalism, etc., right? You see how it creates completely different histories in the women's register. So the work that we see coming out, and this is empirical, so you can actually look at the writings in intersectionality. If you look at Frank Rudy Cooper's work on bipolar masculinity, he makes the same argument, that because black men are oppressed, they seek to dominate others, right? You see this throughout Devin Carballo's work, though I will admit that Carballo's work is a little more nuanced because he does not hold that additive and interactive frames work in every case. But he still does not have a rich discussion of heterosexual black men. It's much more on the side of queer or gay black men that he's making the kind of nuance about how they enjoy power. So the works that have been written about black males and intersectionality takes the view that they still want domination but don't have the power to enact it. Whereas we see very rich historiographies about how intersectionality has changed how black women view issues, how they participate in public culture, how they have certain notions of coalitional justice, etc. Does everybody understand that kind of point, right? Lacey's argument in connection to that would be, well, black men deal with an exponential problem because on the one hand, they're over-masculine or hyper-masculine. And I'll tell you the history of that later. You never want to call black men hyper-masculine. We'll read the word. They're hyper-masculine or they're not masculine enough. So they're effeminate. And he says that this is the dynamic of masculinity when it's put with race that is not captured under the large umbrella of intersectional thought. So you can see how, borrowing from the previous conversation that I explained with Peter Kwan's assumption, that he's saying that when you look at the subject analysis, do black men actually have or benefit from male privilege? He's going to say no, because blackness distorts the male category such that it creates, sometimes overemphasizes it and then de-emphasizes. Does it make sense? Okay. Let's now move to Identity Crisis by Darren Hutchinson. Everybody got it? Yes, no? Yes? All right. So Darren Hutchinson, I really do like his work. He writes one of the first articles on intersectionality and claims that we need a more multidimensionality approach. So I want you to understand the two differences, okay? We know what intersectionality is. If you would go with me to page 309, we'll start talking a little bit about multidimensionality. Y'all see subpoint B, multidimensionality and other extensions of intersectionality? Right there? All right. Middle of the first paragraph. Although heavily influenced by intersectional analysis, the post-intersectionality theorists, so you can see that even the term is reflected in the literature, have offered several improvements to the intersectionality model. In particular, race sexuality critics whose work examines the relationships amongst racism, patriarchy, class domination, and heterosexism are currently developing a sizable body of scholarship that extends intersectionality in new substantive and conceptual terrains. In a series of articles, I've examined the relationship among racism, heterosexism, patriarchy, and class oppression, utilizing a model I refer to as multidimensionality. Multidimensionality, quote, recognizes the inherent complexities of systems of oppression and the social identity categories around which social power and disempowerment are distributed. You should highlight that, you should memorize it, whatever you want to do. Multidimensionality posits that various forms of identity and oppression are inextricably and forever intertwined, and that essentialist equality theories inevitably reflect the experiences of class and race-privileged individuals. So he says that he is in fact influenced by intersectionality theory. Go to 312. Second paragraph. Multidimensionality also complicates the very notions of privilege and subordination. For instance, by focusing on intersecting privilege and subordinate categories, my scholarship has uncovered that heterosexual stereotypes that inform the sexual racism endured by all people of color. Lynching, for example, was frequently justified through a racist, sexualized rhetoric that constructed black males as heterosexual threats to white women. Now, let's look at this example very quickly. When we think of straight, is that a privilege or subordinate category? Privilege. When we look at male, is that a privilege or subordinate category? Privilege, right? When we look at black, privilege or subordinate? So we got two privilege and one subordinate category. Under intersectional thought, do black men enjoy a kind of sexual privilege next to other groups? Black women, specifically? Yes. In multidimensionality, however, Hutchinson says that that's different. Let's look at the example of lynching. So, this heterosexual status, typically a privileged category, served as a source of racial subjugation. Why? Because when you put it in relationship to white women, it's the heterosexuality of black men that is the necessary condition for them to want to rape or be sexually involved with a woman, right? He then says, this history complicates the apparent stability of privileged and subordinate categories. The meanings of these identity categories are instead contextual and shifting. A multidimensional analysis also problematizes the notion of intersecting subordination, a primary focus of intersectionality scholarship. Intersectionality, for example, typically considers women of color subordinate relative to men of color and white women. The inclusion of sexuality, sexual hierarchies in a multidimensional analysis destabilizes this framework. Heterosexist domination privileges heterosexual women of color, the quintessential subjects of intersectionality, and disadvantages lesbians of color. Heterosexism and lesbians of color, semicolon. Heterosexism also marginalizes gay men of color and advantages heterosexual men of color. So multidimensionality, therefore, permits a more nuanced examination of the operation of privilege and subordination amongst social groups. So what point is Hutchinson trying to make here? He's trying to show you that the analytic attached to identities do not always give you accurate depictions of the actual oppression they suffer. So if you say straight black men have always been advantaged by their gender throughout history, and that's like manifestly false, right? So not only through lynching, but even when you talk about rape, because they're raped by white men, they're raped by white women. When you talk about, there's just so much cannibalism. When you talk about, employment, you see all these different disadvantages, right? So Hutchinson, through multidimensionality, and this is going to be taken up in a second by Matua, is arguing that the context of the subjects in history have to matter in terms of how we understand the identities. Does that make sense? So if you're running intersectionality through Crenshaw's model, as we discussed yesterday, that's going to talk about coalitions or new ways of seeing histories of the world or political activity, right? Like something like Black Lives Matter, then you have a very different question or engagement, right? Because we know Black Lives Matter operates on two levels of intersectionality. One, in terms of the say her name, works through intersectional visibility logic. Two, there's this history of erasure that takes up the idea that black women have never been recognized and centered as subjects throughout history, right? And because of that, they're more oppressed. And given how different people in Black Lives Matter talk about it, it's either interactive or it's additive. Sometimes it's both in their mind. The idea for them is that black women or women of color who are lesbian or straight are more oppressed than everyone else. But notice that's an analytic statement, not an empirical. If I get that distinction, right? It comes from the if you take intersectionality as a theory, you would think you would come out with women of color or women with multiple subordinate categories being more oppressed. If you take an empirical context, like social dominance theory, it's going to show the exact opposite. Right? Makes sense to everybody? Everybody get why this teeters on the categories you're using to think of things? The gender category, the heterosexual category, the race category, right? Now let's go to Matua.
What's the name of the article?
Multidimensionality is to masculinities what intersectionality is to feminism. Now, there was a conference a few years ago where the question was, can or does intersectionality apply to black males? Okay? And in that question, there were different views. Some people said yes, intersectionality can capture the black male experience and the experiences of the men of color. Some people said no. Matua's piece really extends upon the work in the term of multidimensionality that was introduced in the previous work by Darren Hutchinson. And I actually like this piece, even though I adamantly disagree with Matua, and you'll see why in a second. Because Matua suggests that many of the things that we study as black male privilege don't empirically flesh out that way, but nonetheless, because black men are men, they have privilege. So while there may be no empirical backing behind it, Matua still, we've had this this discussion, I should say, because we were on the same show, and but nonetheless, I think she's adamantly wrong, and I'm willing to try to show that. So when we start off, we already know the history of intersectionality, and we've kind of got a little bit of the history of multidimensionality or post-intersectional frames. If you go to page 345 with me, subpoint B. And I think this kind of speaks much closer to Lacey's point about the analytic framework than not. I would say before we start this piece that if you're going to run intersectionality or you're thinking about responding to intersectionality, again, there's lots of ways to do that. One would be Kwan's piece on co-synthesis, right? That intersectionality doesn't go far enough. The other could be a straight-up debate about the merits of male privilege, right? Or in this context, you cut these cards and talk specifically about black males in regard to the theory. I think at this point, if you're going to run intersectionality, it is best applied either as a framework to talk about coalitional politics, because that's where the best evidence is, or as a framework to talk about a way to explain some of the experiences of black women. I simply don't believe that it could be applied universally as a framework to see other subjects usefully, but every scholar has their own opinion. So second paragraph, 345. So Matua says, when intersectionality was applied to black men, it was initially interpreted to suggest that black men were privileged by gender and subordinated by race. That is, black men sat at the intersection of the subordinating and oppressive system of race and the privileged system of gender. Intuitively, right, based on the analytics we've been talking about, this seemed correct to everybody. It also seemed to support the dominant social and academic practice of examining the oppressive conditions that black men face from a racial perspective. Yet the interpretation of black men as privileged by gender and oppressed by race appeared incorrect in our observations of racial profiling. Further, while this interpretation seemed to capture some of the differentials between women and men in the black community, as in wage differentials. So Matua is a big fan of, she thinks black men make more than white women. It did not capture the harsher treatment of that black men seem to face, not only in the context of anonymous public space that often characterize racial profiling, but also in terms of higher rates of hyperincarceration, death by homicide and certain diseases, suicide rates, and higher unemployment as compared to black women. These conditions almost seem to negate the idea that black men had any male privilege at all, as posited by feminist theorizing. Thus, I proposed a new phrase to capture the insights we had garnered from our study of racial profiling, amongst other studies. She argues then that black men were not experiencing sexism, a term that has an overlong history that seemed to reference discrimination and oppression of women, but rather was gendered racism. In many ways, gendered racism recognized that black men also stood at the intersection of race and gender, as the operation of gendered racism in the context of racial profiling was counter to the intuition and interpretation of intersectionality theory that suggested that black men were privileged by gender and oppressed by race. It complicated the notion of privilege, an insight I had noted before and at which scholar Darren Hutchinson had also arrived. So what then, do you see the work that scholars are doing around this question of what gender means and what gender references in terms of hierarchy? Okay? So even Matua here is saying, well listen, when you look at this in context, the only kind of male privilege that you would see between groups would be in employment discrimination, or not discrimination, I'm sorry, wage differentials, right? Income differences. Now, one of the problems that I personally have with that account is if you're and notice this is what I mean about kind of the predetermination of many of these frames. If intersectionality says you have advantages and privileges assigned based on subordination and privilege categories interacting, then when she makes this argument about gendered racism, if you take that as the axis, then it would mean that black women have advantages in incarceration, living longer by not dying in homicide, not dying by certain diseases, not committing suicide at higher rates, and not being as unemployed. But nobody that does intersectionality actually talks about black female privilege or black female advantage. So that suggests then that the frame itself is dedicated to certain predetermined notions of male advantage, male privilege, and not the other way around. That's completely fine. But I'm saying that you see the predetermination that people like Lacey, that people like Quan were worried about. That if you're always going to have a system that is going to just tell you different variations of male privilege, then the system's already predetermined because it can't work the other way even when you have evidence to the contrary, right? So again, that is an argument against the universalization of the concept towards all groups. It shows its limitation, right? Doesn't mean it can't be useful when you study, say, black women, but it's going to raise questions about how other subjects fit within that computation. Okay? So, post-intersectionality theorists argue that there are no stable subordinate or privileged categories. Post-intersectionality theorists argue that there are no stable subordinate or privileged categories. That everything requires context. And by context, what we mean by that is the specific study of the group. Here's why. If you start talking about middle-class black women and poor white women, who do you think is more oppressed?
Poor white.
Poor white women, why?
Economic privilege is usually seen in like a hierarchy. So
Okay. So what if somebody says, but she has race and sex stacked against her? Right, you see, because that becomes a ridiculous argument, right? Instead of us just saying, okay, well, look, I studied these poor white women, I studied these middle-class black women in the same environment. Here's the different issues that they're facing. You see, most of our conversations about intersectionality somehow revolve around identity, and this is how y'all use it in debate rounds, right? When intersectional feminist analysis said da 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 da, you're male privilege, da 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 da, you know, it goes on and on and on, ad nauseum. So what we missed in that is whether or not any of what we're saying is actually true. This does not have to be an identity politic battle. I often say of intersectionality theorists, when you speak to them or argue with them, you know, they're saying we don't play the oppression Olympics, but everybody's going for the gold, right? Because the idea is like, let's not compare empirically, right? Because you know me, I like numbers, I like facts and history. Like, this isn't an argument, let's just compare. Like, Bureau of Labor Statistics has what everybody makes, we can compare, right? They're like, no, let's not do that, because then that's playing the oppression Olympics. But accept that because of race and sex, you're on a more disadvantage. Like, well, in some cases, yes. In other cases, no. Right? If you're talking about life expectancy, black women are doing very well. Right? White women are still the longest living group in America. You know, but who knows? Maybe it's a white female privilege, I don't know. Right? But when you talk about education, things of that, historically black women have done well, black men have not. You know, these things change over time, so you have to be aware of that. You can't make a claim that certain groups never change, even amongst patriarchy. The notion we have of patriarchy is very, very recent. Before, say, 1970, we talked about paternalism. So white women were suggesting that the reason, this is where we get the whole nuclear family thing. White women were saying that they're oppressed, and I think this part's true, because they're paternally overseen by white men, such that they're confined to certain private spaces and not put in other public spaces. But the analogy that people like Alva Murdaugh and Hacker were using in the 40s and 50s to get white women to be minorities wasn't based on women, it was based on black people. So when you go back and read those texts, and we'll read that when we get to the gender section, white women in social sciences were looking at how do they treat the Negro and saying white women were minority groups on that basis. So this is a recent phenomenon. This was 1951. 1960 when they're having these kinds of debates. Now that's not to say that white women are oppressed, don't take me to be saying that. But what I'm saying is you have to understand the development of the idea of how that oppression became unique, right? Instead of just saying, oh, we've always held the same ideas about oppression and identity that we hold today. That would be fundamentally false. The same thing with the way that we think about intersectionality. Intersectionality privileges categories that were written in Title VII jurisprudence. it simply does not hold true that gender explains all of that with black women, because in the 19th century, there simply was no concept of gender. Black people were fighting for gender. They were fighting for patriarchy because that showed that they had evolved. And this wasn't something that only black men do, contrary bell hooks with no citations. This is something that black people did, because if you were Christian, if you were middle class, if you were educated, if you spoke English, these are all things that people like Anna Julia Cooper and Alexander Crummell bought into. Right? It's the same thing that Ida B. Wells and Olivia Washington bought into, and some of the same things that this one like a just pompous middle class. I don't want to say Delaney. Say like Schomburg or Scarborough, right? I mean, you know, they all these are cultural phenomena, right? These are not simply broken by the a priori assumption that that gender dictates people's different views. If you go very quickly to the labor force characteristics, I'd like you to go to table 16. This is what you should pull up on my Facebook page. So this is the thing that you use to kind of check whether or not there are large wage disparities. And you can go up and you can look at how much overtime, et cetera, that black men work, et cetera. You know, so it's a good resource. But if you look at the mean average and earning power of men, and they're divided by columns, so white men are on the one side, black men are next to them, Asian, et cetera. From 1979, you see huge disparities between black men and white men. And very similar disparities between white women and white men. But you can see by the early 1980s, it's around 82, 83, white women have certainly caught up to any disparities that you see in workforce with black men. It's despite black men, you know, doing more male jobs, of course, dangerous work, longer hours, manufacturing, things of that sort. If you look further down, you see that white women actually surpass black men's earnings by the early 90s. And with black women, you can see that if you look at the last 10 years, they're very similar. Black men generally make about, in a given year, roughly 3,000 more than black women, and that number doesn't include overtime. That being said, this is not an argument to prove who's more oppressed. This is an argument to show you variance, to show you how things change. And that with any given snapshot that you take, like if you took the early 1979s or 1980s, of course, even black men make more than white women. If you go further down, it completely changes with the shifts of the economy, right? If you look at what black men were doing next to black women, you see that, yes, there is this huge disparity in the 70s and 80s. By the early 90s, it shrinks. Right? And remember, when you're taking things like unemployment and incarceration, which these numbers do not, it shrinks even more. So you're talking about, we've done these calculations for another article we did. What you're talking about is black men basically make $56 more per week than black women. And that's with working an average of 7 hours more per week. Because they work roughly 0.7, 0.8 hours per day longer than their female counterpart. These things matter in terms of how we understand problems. This does not mean that there is no sexism. This does not mean that there is no patriarchy. It doesn't mean any of that. It simply means that if you're going to say that black male privilege exists because of wage disparity, and you see this variation of wage disparity across groups, you have to be careful what you pick. Right? You have to give a full account of it. You can't just pick the years that support your view. So when we do intersectionality, it suggests that we need more variance and variation to account for the categories that we're talking about. For example, if we say that wage inequality means that there's patriarchy, does that mean that black men are less patriarchal because their wage gap is smaller? Because black women generally make around 61 cents per dollar, black men generally make around 64, 65. That's the smallest wage gap in any race. Does that mean they're less patriarchal? Right? I mean, how do we understand these things if that's the measure? Right? Because then we assume the larger wage gap would be more patriarchal. Right? The wage gap is a horrible way to do it, but nonetheless, that's what people choose popularly. See, how do we measure patriarchy? Bless you. How do we measure the patriarchy or the gap between men and women? I mean, think if we flipped it the other way. So what if we say something like incarceration is evidence of male oppression, or incarceration, or what else? What did male fall behind on? Life expectancy. You see, it's what you pick and choose. So you have to have a frame that can account for both sides. Now, when we read people like R.W.S. Connell and her work on hegemonic masculinity, which I think is very important because I know y'all hear this in debate rounds all the time, or toxic masculinity, she's going to give an account of subordinate masculinity that talks about disposability. So it's not, male disposability does not come from some crazy, what do they call it? It starts with an M. MGTOW thingy, the men's rights stuff. It doesn't, huh? Yeah, like the men's rights people. Yeah, they're all white people. I had to look them up because I was like, you're men's rights? I was like, they're all white. not really down with them. But anyway, the point being, Connell makes that claim that there is a male disposability because she says that within patriarchal societies, you have dominant ruling class men, you have working class men who are subordinate, who work for and are exploited by ruling class males. So within that category of subordinate masculinity, you're going to see different kind of disparities in health, life expectancy, violence, and sheer disposability, which is why you generally send poor white men out in the army, things like that, to fight wars. So she explains this within the dynamic of patriarchy and hegemonic masculinity. If there have been people outside the United States that have been trying to combine intersectionality theory with hegemonic masculinity theory, and what they've decided to fall upon has been the question of empiricism. When do these things interact? When do they not interact? And I think that would be very close to what you get out of Lacey, right? When is this switched on? When is this switched off? But there is no stable assumption that all males benefit from X the same way that all females are disadvantaged through X. And I think it's interesting because when we get to the gender section on hegemonic masculinity, I think some of you will be shocked who Connell actually believes are hegemonic masculines. Because she believes that career-oriented capitalist women are also hegemonic masculines or emphasize feminines. So emphasize femininity is, you know how this works really well for white women. So this is an example right now. In your culture, you have this kind of the effeminate virtue, right? You know, how the vulnerability that white women play off of, that make them wanted and desired. It's like when white women cry and all the white men rush to their aid, right? That's a cultural response that's built, and Connell talks about this because she says, emphasize femininity is what gives justification and legitimacy to hegemonic masculinity. So for hegemonic masculinity to work, which is basically the idea that there should be a kind of masculinity that's ideal, that's strong, that's courageous, that can control things, you need to have a vulnerable femininity that works alongside it. Now again, this is Connell's idea. So she says that in order for white supremacism and capitalism to grow, you have white women become effeminate, more effeminate, to justify the political and economic projections of ruling class men. All right. A few years later, she developed that, and she's like, yeah, some of these capitalist women, like Margaret Thatcher, who want to colonize the world, yeah, I think they fit patriarchy pretty well. So again, like I said, I know how you are debating these things in rounds, but the actual scholarship is much, much more complex and nuanced than just what it comes down to in a 30, 40-minute round. Okay? All right, questions? Questions? That went down smoothly. Didn't contradict anything you believed. I'm going to have to be more provocative next time. Yes, ma'am.
So the alternative, according to like Matua and Hutchinson's then, would be like a paradigm of like multisectionality as opposed to intersectionality?
Multidimensionality.
Right. What would something like that look like if you were to give an example?
It would be a critique of intersectionality that focused on gendered racism and sought to disown the idea of male privilege as universal. So you would actually critique their frame. So when someone said intersectionality leads to more liberation, X, Y, and Z, you can run any series of arguments about how they exclude certain kinds of perspectives. One of the sections of Matua's piece, which is actually really interesting, is she said that rather than intersectionality theorists responding to these criticisms like post-intersectionality or multidimensionality, they just absorb them. So she says that one of the things that happened with Crenshaw's theory is you had Crenshaw leave those two articles out for a while, never respond to anybody. Then the next time we started talking about it, she's talking about it like it's multidimensional or co-synthesis, like there's any endless combination of paradigms that one could assimilate into intersectionality theory. And, you know, I could say as a scholar, that's not, because I'm a philosopher, that's not necessarily the best approach. Because you basically take all your criticism and say, oh, I was vague enough that everything becomes mine, right? So I think that the way to really get at intersectionality is at its utilization of the gender category. And in my book, I write a very long section explaining who influenced Crenshaw, because she basically takes this from second wave feminists like Catherine McKinnon, who influenced Crenshaw, where McKinnon gets her ideas, and how stable that gender category is. So I think that that's the most effective way to criticize this kind of thinking, if you're running against it. If you're running it, I think you have to go for the kind of coalitional arguments. You're going to have to kind of blow up political intersectionality and land on the sword in terms of whether or not you think black women specifically or women of color more generally have been doubly, triply, et cetera, oppressed. The problem is if somebody pulls out social dominance theory or somebody who pulls out these articles, I think they have pretty good evidence or at least as good story as to why history is more complex than categories that are pointed to from Title VII perspectives. Because you have to remember this. There was, when you read the history of Title VII, sex wasn't going to be in it. They put sex in it to kill the bill. They thought, well, if we put sex in it, then we're not going to have to give black people rights. You know, so sex wasn't like, oh, white women were just so discriminated against. It was a very specific group of feminists arguing about economic and wage discrimination that were able to work with certain lobbyist interests who wanted to kill the bill that got sex in. And when the debates between sex, if you are interested in this history, I can give you an article or two about it. But if you're interested in this history, what the articles show and what the congressional record shows is that the argument was about black women and white women because they feared that if they gave race in Title VII, that it would stop white women from having the ability to sue against employers, even black employers. So that's how you put sex in. So the competition on the congressional floor wasn't about men and women, it was about white women being able to sue under sex versus black women being able to sue under race. You know, nobody, you haven't heard that. So that completely challenges the way or the dominant frame by which we interpret intersectionality, which is allegedly based on a protected class of race that means men, because on the congressional floor that's not what it meant, and a protected class that means sex whereas white women. That part was true because that's what they were actually doing, right? So, like I said, history and knowledge of these things are much more interesting and complex than just what we've been told or what we read on blogs. Right. Next question. Sir.
So you mentioned how you think that wage gap is not an accurate predictor of patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
What statistic do you think is a more accurate predictor then?
I think that it's hard to measure because it's hard to measure a universal predictor of patriarchy because when you look at things like education or life expectancy and death and, you know, even how much people, you know, make, women don't always fall at the bottom. They're not, you know what I mean? Like patriarchy assumes that women should be on the bottom of those measures, and they're not. So even in like if you look at the black race, in education, black women have always had an educational advantage. So, and they've always been more employed than black men. And, you know, so I guess, I just don't know how you reconcile that with the meaning of patriarchy. You know, I think with the white race you can do it in the sense that you have to basically talk about wealth. Right? I think wealth is a much more accurate descriptor. But then again, when you look at white women's wealth becomes almost on par with white men, especially because white men die and they inherit it, but they have to marry into each other. So I think that patriarchy as a frame, if you're talking about economics, works well in the case of white people, excluding marriage, but not so well when you start talking about black, Latino, or indigenous people, because their situations are often reversed. You know, and I think, to be honest with you, that's why I think that when we have these debates, you know, when you talk about black male patriarchy, you're talking about like they took the lead in civil rights, they ran the American Negro Academy, they, you know, it's anecdotal. Stokely Carmichael once said in a meeting, the position of women were prone. You know, like, all that's false, by the way, it's an introduction to my book. But it's hard because when you talk about patriarchy, you're talking about like militaries, you're talking about governments, you're talking about the institutions and culture of society which says women are here and men are here, you have the power to enforce that, right? There's not a lot of colonized groups that have that. You know, I think that that's not to say there's not sexism, there's not misogyny, there's, you know, all those things, but I just don't know how you measure the structure of patriarchy when it keeps failing. But see, the ironic part is when you measure race, everything lines up in this country, right? You know, wealth, health, life expectancy, social mobility, intergenerational transfer. Like, well, I mean, when you talk about race and white people, it's like a gold mine. That's why it's so expensive. Like every day, every year, somebody's like, here's a new study. Here's a new study. More inequality, right? I mean, Becky Pettit's book's awesome because she's like, we're so racist that there have been no there's probably been no civil rights gains for black men because of incarceration and unemployment. She's like, so this is how racist America is. You get to see those disparities clearly. I just think that unless you're measuring something like specific white men to white women longitudinal things, that you don't really get to see patriarchy affect outside of the white race. You know. But again, that's my opinion. Other scholars of democracy may disagree. Other questions? Okay. Next question. Come on, I know somebody's got something hard, challenging. Dr. Kerr, we just adamantly disagree. See, things change when you read articles. You're debaters, say something. I just need 2 more questions. 2 questions, we could go. You're smiling at me. You want to say something. You're smiling. You're smiling. You made eye contact. You got to ask a question now.
I don't have one though. He raised his hand.
Shifting the burden.
I just, could you explain a little more about like the development of exponential intersectionality?
Yeah, Lacey's. Yeah. So Lacey said that he thinks there's something missing with intersectional accounts of black men. He doesn't think that he does not think that they're always privileged by their maleness and disadvantaged by their race. He thinks that these things work synergistically, which is why I say it, that it could be a kind of interactive theory, which he names exponential intersectionality, exponential discrimination.
So it's not like a take on additive, it's a take on interactive.
Yeah, it will be a take. It could be understood. He doesn't use that term, but it could be a take on interactive intersectionality, which he calls exponential discrimination. Because he says the reason it's exponential is because on both sides of it, it could be exponentially more masculine or exponentially less masculine. And those have
There's no
2
middle
different
ground.
trajectories.
So his argument is like there's not really a middle ground.
Right. That there's no stability in the male section of discrimination. Because under intersectionality, you're going to say, oh, men have privilege, right? Black men have privilege. If you're using intersectional visibility, black men are centered more as victims of the state, X, Y, and Z. You know, so Lacey's like, I don't know what that means. Because when you go and investigate privilege, when you say, how many black men are in college, how many black men are employed, how many black men are this, the empirics don't line up with the theory. Right? So that's his kind of challenge.
How would multisectionality interact with like the idea of coalitions when we assume
Multidimensionality?
Yeah, but you
You keep calling it different things every time. Okay.
How do we assume that multidimensionality interacts with like coalitions when we frequently view coalitions as like involving identity politics, and this would like require a bunch of different groups?
Yeah, I think would break it down in some instances, to be honest with you. Because if you take gendered racism seriously, and you know, given the work I do, you know, you can use the same arguments about like domestic abuse or employment discrimination on both sides. So if gay black men could have reasons to not align with straight black men have reasons not to align with black women. If the argument is going to be about what kind of history we agree with, I think multidimensionality upsets that. It doesn't mean there can't be other coalitions, right, against anti-subordination practices which would take all those things into account. But there's been a resistance on the side of feminism to give accounts of female perpetrated violence. So I think that's one of the limitations, and I think you kind of see that limitation. A good colleague of mine recently wrote a book called Spare the Child, where she was actually talking about child abuse in the black community. And, you know, she's got a lot of pushback from feminists because they're not happy with the idea that she's showing systematically that black people, black women abuse children. So there are certain conversations that are never going to fit within the intersectional paradigm. Because once you start having those conversations, those coalitions start breaking down.
So then if the coalitions break down, it's like, wouldn't there be like a pretty big like solvency deficit on the alt if the app is claiming to solve?
Absolutely. But again, this is what I mean. If you agree that there's a patriarchy and all men are privileged, the intersectionality has a pretty good argument for why there are coalitions against racism, patriarchy, etc. Right? Because notice most intersectional logic says you can't see patriarchy. Nobody sees patriarchy but women. But when you look at some of the theories they're using, it's quite clear that people like Lacey saying black men understand patriarchy, because sometimes they're more men and sometimes they're less men, right? Next to ideal white men. So that claim would be false. So the question becomes, can intersectionality account for all the different identities and all the different histories? And some post-intersectionality remain very pessimistic and doubtful that it actually can. Is that it?
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.